Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Have you ever had any financial counseling? I remember once when I was about 21, 22 years old, I sat with a financial advisor as part of my internship, and he did one of those overviews of financial health, well-being, investment, savings, retirement, all of it. And one of the challenges was he asked me to look at every penny that I spent over the course of a month to track where all my money went. The point of that was for you to get this sort of a handle on where you spend your money and where it all goes. But it also, if you scratch below the surface, it tells you what's important to you. It tells you what you love. It tells you what you're interested in and what you're devoted to. It was a sort of audit that helped me get some handle on what was important to me and what choices I was making about where I wanted to go for my future. And what I found back in those days was I didn't have much of a plan. I spent sort of willy-nilly. You could do the same sort of audit with your day. Where do you spend your time? If you were to journal it and make a little pie graph or a chart, how much time do you spend on the computer? How much time do you spend doom scrolling or streaming? How much time do you spend complaining? If you were to jot down the time and energy spent in traffic or whatever it is that you do, and then you were to look at your day, you would find out what ends up actually being most important to you. And more, you would find out what shapes your imagination, what's forming your soul, what's forming the very core of your inner life. So doing an analysis is important, but then also asking yourself what sorts of things can you put in your day to direct you to what you would consider to be virtuous living or the good life or the image that of flourishing that you think is the right one. What will speak to you spiritually in ways that connect you with the divine, with your own self, with others, with the world around you? Today on the show, we're going to talk to Rabbi Peter Berg. He is the rabbi at the temple, which is a historic Reformed Jewish synagogue in Atlanta, Georgia. It was bombed back in the 1950s. It was part of the film. You can see it in Driving Miss Daisy. And for a lot of years, I have been friends with and neighbors to Rabbi Peter Berg. He is a Jewish thought leader here in the city of Atlanta. He's often featured in publications like our own Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but also in the New York Times, as he thinks through Jewish identity, issues facing the Jewish community, and social justice. When I'm in their facility, I love to see the values they have written all over their walls. One of them is tikkun olam, which is this Jewish notion of being repairers or restorers of creation. It is a deeply held value within Judaism, and I would suggest also within the other Abrahamic faiths. But it's one that congregation is committed to as they stand in the gap for the poor, the disenfranchised, and those on the margins. Rabbi Berg has a deeply ethical impulse, and being around him makes me want to be a better person. He's a friend of mine, and he's going to talk to us a little bit today about what I think is something new to most of the people who listen to this podcast called Mussar spirituality. Join us today as we here at Complex Creatures explore the complexity of our human animality and how we like to connect, think, and delve into topics like spirituality. Because it's not just for our own personal growth, but it can make us better for the common good. Join us today as we hear from Rabbi Peter Berg. Well, hello, Rabbi. How are you doing today?
Doing great, thank you.
So we were going to talk to you today about the concept in Jewish spirituality called Mussar. Can you give us a brief description of what that means? What is that?
Sure. It's an honor to be here. Mussar is it's a spiritual and an ethical discipline that really focuses on personal growth. It focuses on character development. It focuses on living a virtuous life. That's the main goal of Mussar, and it's rooted in traditional Jewish teachings seeking to help individuals refine their characters. And there's a Hebrew word for these character traits known as midot. Midot is the Hebrew word for character traits, so that you're aligning your actions and your intentions with the ethical and spiritual ideals of Jewish tradition. That's the basic gist of it.
When I looked at it briefly based on email correspondence with you, Peter, I really did see a lot of resonance with a lot of Christian spirituality. There's contemplative practices. It seems a lot like virtue ethics is applied to it. There's certain acts of deeds. Let me ask the question, where, when we're talking about virtue or midot, talking about good deeds, service, acts of service, where are these outlined or defined? Does this come straight from Scripture, or do they come from the traditions, the midrash, the teachings, where does that come from? Who defines that?
Good question. It really comes from medieval scholars. There's a famous scholar named Rabbi Bachya ibn Pakuda, and he wrote a book called Duties of the Heart, which later developed into this, in Lithuania in the 19th century, into this formalized Mussar movement, emphasizing the practical application of Torah teaching to everyday life, like your ethical behavior, your personal accountability, your spiritual discipline. And it focuses on different core character traits that I mentioned earlier are called midot. And examples of these would be humility, patience, gratitude, generosity, integrity. They all have Hebrew names. Compassion, for example, is rachamim. And the basic premise is that these traits are not seen as being inherently good or inherently bad, but rather they require balance to avoid the extreme ends of the spectrum. So even something like compassion, there's a shadow side so compassion requires balance, and gratitude requires balance. And there's such thing as being too generous, for example.
Yeah, that resonates with me. My theological tradition and background leads me down the road of virtue ethics quite a bit. So in virtue ethics, really, there's a lot of focus on what Aristotle taught, then Thomas Aquinas, and it goes through a strong medieval vein. And really, you are talking about a balance between extremes. And I find that to be both helpful and challenging to think about and think through. I think it's just easier for us to look at something and go good or bad, like anger, good or bad. But the reality is, as complicated creatures that we are, we seem to have anger, or the capacity for anger for a reason.
There's a time to get angry. I mean, there are things to be angry about.
It's just what you do with it, right?
Right.
I'm very curious, because when I did my cursory looking into Mussar, you already said something about it coming from Lithuania, or at least some influence in Lithuania. But I saw it being associated with Orthodox Judaism. Is that correct? Am I correct in seeing that?
No, I think it's a discipline that can be used by any of the denominations of Jewish tradition. It doesn't matter whether you're Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist. It certainly has its origins in a more traditional practice, but I think that it is today it's being widely used by, I'll use the word progressive, meaning non-Orthodox Jews all over the world. It's very popular right now because people, as you said, are interested in value-based ethics and combining ethics with practice and spiritual learning.
Let me ask you a question, because I sometimes think that we make assumptions that people are already caught up to us in the conversation. I want to make sure that for those who are listening for maybe the first time, maybe they know a Jewish friend or two, but they're just not really versed in all the different denominations. And I don't want you to go so deep that it's confusing, but can you give us just a quick, brief sketch of the differences between conservative, Orthodox, Reform?
Sure. Sure. At one point in time, there were no denominations. There were just Jews. And it was, it was a sort of a more traditional bent, although not everybody practiced in that way. The first denomination to come along was the Reform movement, which is my movement, which is the most modern and the most progressive. And it came along as a reaction to the singular Judaism with no denominations and no movements, and a desire to want to integrate into the world and into society, a desire to have equality, for example, between men and women, to have worship services become more dignified, those kinds of things. And uh, Orthodoxy came as a response to reform, to sort of say, wait a minute, you're changing too much. We got to keep things the same. So there are some fundamental differences between reform and conservative, that are both in terms of practice and in terms of belief. So, for example, an example of a reform practice would be, uh, individuals are obligated to study the different commandments. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. We have to study them and learn about them. And then the ethical ones we're obligated to follow, and the ritual ones we can make educated choices about. Whereas in Orthodox tradition, you're obligated to follow the 613 commandments as is, with no question. So that's sort of an example. An example in terms of Jewish thought would be about the origin of the Torah. The Reform movement would say that human beings were involved in the creation of the Torah, that it's inspired by God, but that humans are involved in the creation of the Torah. Whereas in an Orthodox tradition, they would say that the Torah is 100% divinely inspired and no human activity involved in the creation of the Torah. So those are examples. And then conservative Judaism is a little bit in the middle. It came third, and they said, we're going to borrow a little bit from this one and a little bit from this one, and it's kind of in between the two.
We have a very similar cognate within Christian branches of whether you go more progressive, more conservative, more strict adherence, more a principle, finding the principle. So I think I follow what you're saying, but I noted a moment ago you said that Mussar is being practiced all over more progressive or more reformed synagogues and practitioners, right? This is something that people are finding life in, this particular set of practices, correct?
Correct. Right. It started as a medieval endeavor, and I want to say it almost died out. I mean, there was a period of time where nobody would have even heard of the word, and it was reinvented in Lithuania in the 19th century by Rabbi Israel Salanter. He reinvented he brought it back and made it popular again. And now it's become even more popular than the 19th century, because it's being practiced now by all the different denominations.
Why do you think that's the case? Why is it reemerged? What about it speaks for people that are living today?
I think people are searching for ways to connect to God in new and different and unique ways, and looking to bring a sense of spirituality to their lives. And there's such a practical element to the Mussar practice, because the midah, the virtue of patience, savlanut in Hebrew, that applies to all of us every day, or of gratitude, which is called hakarat hatov, the practice of bringing gratitude into our lives, and trying to recall things that we're grateful for that we sometimes take for granted. So I think it's become, it's natural in an age where people are seeking spirituality and to connect with God, that this would become more popular in today's society.
I'm finding it fascinating. We've all, our whole world's come through the Enlightenment and certain enlightened values.
Yeah, ours too.
The whole world. We're modernistic, and then some people would say we've been postmodern. Some, that's philosophical questioning. But we've gotten to this place where we are as a people. It's highly individualized. We are focusing on self-expression and authenticity as ideals. And at the same time, I get a sense that there's a sense of feeling unmoored. People are looking for something to hold on to. So right now, you can go to any number of Silicon Valley types and see them turning to Stoic philosophy as something, as an anchor to hold on to. You can read journals and writings by rather atheistic thought leaders who are really leaning into the practice of gratitude as a life-giving and essential one. I'm even finding people. I was at a dinner party the other night with an atheist neighbor of mine who talked about his spirituality, uh, and that for me is a strange vocabulary, but it's one that people utilize. So I think people are looking for something, and sometimes they're looking for traditions, or what they find are rather traditional things like gratitude, like you just mentioned, hospitality, these virtues that are found in the great traditions, yet they're finding them maybe separate from the tradition. Mussar is a way of naming some of these values and ethics or virtues, but it's firmly rooted in Torah, you would say? It's firmly rooted right in the foundation?
Yes, firmly rooted in Torah and Talmud, which comes after Torah, and there are, I didn't get into yet the different kinds of practices that there are, because there are many different ways to actually practice the Mussar tradition. One is through the study of the classic Mussar texts, right? These are the ones that like Rabbi Bachya Ibn Pakuda and others have written classic Mussar texts that we can go back and study today. There's also meditation and visualization, and these are practices that people are really yearning for in the world today, reflecting on a specific value, a specific midah, uh, and visualizing how to embody them in your daily life and in the world, and how to make the world better. There's an element of journaling that is very popular, part of the Mussar tradition. And then, of course, there's an element of group study. There are typically people meet in these groups called va'adim to discuss ideas and hold one another accountable for making progress and moving forward. So there's another element, and you and I have talked about this before in our conversations. There is certainly an element of personal transformation that exists as part of the Mussar tradition, but it's also about bringing greater harmony and holiness into the world. That also becomes a key component to this practice. The idea is that by refining your own character, you become better equipped to contribute to society and to community as a whole, and to fulfill your spiritual potential that you have. So it's really a very meaningful practice in the modern world, and it gives us a sense of integrity and living with purpose.
One thing I absolutely adore about the Jewish tradition, of course, as a Christian myself, I mean, this is just part of our larger tradition that we have inherited as Christians. But one thing is, like, whenever you get into the text of the Torah, or when you get to the prophets, or when you look at the New Testament text for Christians, it's so deeply Jewish in background. You don't get a very individualistic spirituality. You get a spirituality that leads to justice.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I feel like through history, where Christians sometimes have gone wrong is to disconnect the two, making one personal piety and the other maybe secondary. But I very much value what you're saying. This formative practice of Mussar, like any other Jewish practice, is supposed to make you a better citizen, or a better family member, a better person, for a better just-minded person in the world. Correct? You'd
Yes.
agree?
There's an element of Jewish law. I find this to be fascinating. An element of Jewish law that says that a sanctuary where you worship should have windows to be able to look out into the world. And the idea is that the prayer is not meant just to stay here in this sanctuary, in this room, but rather we pray so that it influences our behavior outside of the walls of the synagogue. So you have to be able to look out and to see the world outside the synagogue, to remind you that you have an obligation to fix and repair the world, in addition to fixing and repairing yourself.
So your prayer has to have legs. That's my little catchphrase.
Yeah.
So you reference repairing the world, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the language of tikkun olam.
Yes.
Is that? I've actually not. I don't know this. Is tikkun olam referenced in the scriptures, or is that a rabbinic?
No, tikkun olam is a mystical concept. It has to do with it's a complicated concept called shivrat hakelim, the breaking of the vessels, and it has to do with the vessels, God created these vessels, and they shattered, and the pieces shattered, and we have to fix and repair um, these vessels and make the world better. And there's really two components to it. There's tikkun midot, the repair of yourself, which are these virtues that we've been talking about, and tikkun olam, which is repairing of the world. And that you have to be working on both of these at the same time. You can't be focused on one to the exclusion of the other. That you have to constantly be looking at yourself and the greater world, and we have obligations to both of them. And repairing the self repairs the world. It fixes and repairs the world too.
Because if you're properly prepared, then you are put in a right order in your place in the world. So one follows from the other, correct? Is that,
Yeah, it's exactly right.
One thing I like to tell people, because I'm a big fan of Mr. Rogers, and Mr. Rogers, when he was in retirement, and then 9/11 happened, and PBS said, gee, we better pull Fred out of retirement to speak to America. And he didn't want to do it. He didn't think he had anything left to say, which is amazing to me. I mean, sometimes it's the great souls that don't realize that,
The documentary about him was so interesting. I
oh yeah.
loved it.
Yeah, well, it was. And when they brought him back out, he sat and he looked at the camera and on his set, and he said, and here he's a Presbyterian minister.
Right.
And he says, we need to be what our Jewish friends call tikkun olam. That's what we need to be, is repairers of the world. And I found that.
So that after 9/11?
Yeah, to America.
Wow.
And this is the last thing he did, nationally on television.
Oh.
And it's a profound, profound witness. So when you were going through some of the practices of Mussar, you use the word visualization, which I would think, that sounds really modern. That sounds now. It doesn't sound so medieval or ancient. And I realize that we can apply a modern word to something that is older, but can you think of places in Scripture where visualization is maybe talked about or referenced or even just practiced? Or is that maybe just a kind of a contemporary word applied to a set of understandings from Scripture? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a little bit of both. I mean, you can make an argument that there's some visualization happening in the Ezekiel story, passages, but I think that it's more of a modern practical application to an ancient study and an ancient practice. But I do think that the rabbis, even in the medieval times, which was certainly well after the biblical period, in medieval times, were involved in meditation and visualization and journaling and all these things that have contemporary modern words. I don't know if they were using those words, but I think that they were probably working on those practices even in the medieval times.
Well, I use the word mindfulness and contemplation in reference to a New Testament text from a Jewish writer named Paul, when he says in Philippians, he says, finally, brothers and sisters, he gives a list of things to think about, and translations change them, but whatever is good, whatever is beautiful, whatever is worthy, whatever is noble, whatever is righteous, think of these things. And I always think of that as a very interesting, prescient, perhaps, ancient way of thinking about contemplation, because he's directing your mind to things that are good.
Yeah.
And so, I think that these modern concepts can help sometimes understand the old, but I was curious about that. And I'm also curious, do you have a favorite of these practices, or one that you naturally lean towards in your own practice?
I'm a big fan of a mantra, of repeating words and phrases over and over again, and to really incorporate them into your heart and into your life, and to think about them. I'll post a biblical phrase, or one that I'm using, for example, to work on a particular value, a particular midah that might be out of balance. And if I can find a word or a phrase to repeat over and over again, in sometimes even in a chant-like mantra, I find that to be extremely effective and something that I like to do. But Jewish spiritual practices really vary so widely, And there are so many levels of observances and connection to God and ethical living and community that one can employ, from prayer in Hebrew tefillah. Torah study itself is considered to be a spiritual practice, the study of the text, particularly with other people. We call it in Hebrew chavruta, which the idea is that you partner with another person to analyze and discuss and foster intellectual and spiritual growth while you're poring over the texts. It could be observance of Shabbat and holidays, or of the different commandments, those relating to kashrut or charity, tzedakah, or ethical living, religious practices like wearing a prayer shawl or hanging up a mezuzah at the doorpost of your house. These are all examples of spiritual practices, meditation, mysticism. We have one of my favorites is it's called a nigun in Hebrew. It's a wordless melody where there's no word. It's just a melody. And they just repeat over and over and over again. And you have a chance to really concentrate and develop a spiritual framework.
Is that the melody itself, or are there other melodies that you
Oh, there's a gazillion of them. That's just one of them. And there are, we'll do even on a typical Friday night Shabbat service, we'll often do 2 or 3 different nigunim, wordless melodies, where everybody can participate and just sing "Lie, Lie, Lie," and then they can join in and feel like they're a part of it. And there are no words. The words are whatever's happening in your heart are the words.
I'm struck by the particular brilliance of the spiritual traditions and practices, because maybe they were developed through observation of the human animal, or maybe they were inspired. But melody, there's nothing quite is helpful for memorization or even locating one emotionally than melodies and music.
Yeah, even the Torah itself is set to a melody.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I love coming to worship and hearing it. And then you're talking about a mantra of repetition, talking about forming the mind around something. Now, would you consider, back to how you like to do a mantra, would you consider the Shema a mantra that was like an ancient mantra that was repeated everywhere and all over the place?
In a way, I think it is particularly if you're repeating it over and over and over again, which in the service we would just do it, one time. But there are times when I've turned the Shema into a mantra where I'm repeating it and really concentrating on the letters and the words and the meaning, and then I think it really does become a mantra for sure.
I think about it because in Deuteronomy, just like repeating this great teaching to your children wherever you go, put it on the doorposts and the phylacteries, and just surround yourself with this concept. That's what stuck in my mind when you said if you're working on a value, you might find a way to phrase it and put it all around. Do you hang your mantra up on the mirror or anything like that, or is it?
Sometimes I put little Post-its all over the place to remind myself, so that when I have a break, I can turn off the lights and really think and concentrate. And so yeah, sometimes yes.
That's fascinating. Let me, not listed in the list of Mussar, but let me tell you something just of my observations about, I would say, just the Jewish way of being, whether it's ancient or medieval or even modern. Storytelling seems to me to be right at the heart of everything. Your calendar year is a story. When your feasts and fasts are telling the story. How does story tell? So if you're telling the story of your people and how God has interacted with the people and redeemed the people, or established the people, telling that story culturally and through your celebrations through the year is formative, I would think.
Yeah, that's a great point, and really spot on about Jewish tradition. You remember that Jewish tradition existed well before the printing press. And, before stories were written down, they were passed on orally. And that's how Jewish tradition was passed from one generation to the next, through storytelling. And all the holidays have an element of storytelling to them as well. Think about Passover for a moment. We have an actual book called the Haggadah, which means the telling. and we sit down at our Passover Seder and we take out this special book and we tell the story of Passover so that it becomes significant in each and every generation. And the idea is that we were slaves in Egypt and we have to prevent slavery from ever happening again. What are some modern elements of slavery that exist? And we could talk about things like, human trafficking or however slavery still exists today. And so we use storytelling. A lot of the sermons that we give are stories that have a moral to them. And look, Christian tradition has great, a Garrison Keillor, and has great examples of individuals who use homiletics, who tell sermons through stories as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to you before about the tales of the Hasidim.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the search. I mean, as a Christian preacher, I was on the search for a repository of Jewish stories, because I find that in that great tradition, so many great parables, so many great, just deeply spiritual, resonant stories, and sometimes they have this impactful punch to them that just really gets you. And that's the one I found anyway. And so I sometimes it's not laid out real easily where I can find a theme. I have to just read. But that labor of reading itself is a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
You're exploring and poring over stories that have some sort of illumination element to it. Illuminates the mind, right?
Absolutely. And we have search tools on the internet in 2024 that we can use to find these stories in, based on subject matter in a much easier way.
Yeah, well, Fred Craddock was a Christian preacher who told stories.
Yeah, I've got his book.
Yeah, he's part of my tradition. If you look at this book, someone collected his stories, because he's a famous Appalachian storyteller. I talked to the editor of that book. I went golfing with him once, and I'm like, that book's great. I really wish that you had an index for stories so I could research. And he goes, well, when I sat with Fred, I said, should we put an index in? And Fred said, nah, make the preacher work.
That's great. But it's a great book, Craddock Stories. I love that book.
It is a good one. Yeah. Another thing I think about, and this, by the way, I do not at all like to get into the world of stereotyping. And there's such sensitivity that we all need to have about the way we describe and think about one another, especially in days like our own right now. But I tend to think of humor being associated with Jewish culture. Does humor, I mean, a lot of these stories are hilarious, but do you think humor has a place in a spiritual tradition or habit?
100%. There's humor in the Bible. There's humor in the Talmud. We've always had and utilized humor, and there's absolutely a time and a place for it. And I think it actually is to some extent a spiritual practice in and of itself. People love to laugh, and it's healing to laugh.
Mm.
So I try sometimes to use humor in my sermons. I don't, there's a time and a place for it. I don't do it all the time.
Right.
But I think people.
It's a tough thing to pull off. If you can't, I always tell people, if they're trying to preach, I said, be very careful before using humor, because if it works great. But if it doesn't.
Yeah, no, we've all tanked a joke. I mean,
yeah, that's true. That's true. Wow. Listen, I really appreciate this kind of overview of Mussar. Let me ask another one. Besides the mantras, on a personal level, what do you find in it in terms of a practice that helps you? I mean, I think all of them can help you become a person that is better, not just for yourself, but for the broader world. But is there one specifically, or a couple, that you really think help us, if we are practicing these practices, to become better citizens or to become better for the public sphere?
I think they all are, and the idea in Mussar is that each person has some midot, has some spiritual character traits that are that are their focus, that they're really good at, and it's good to know what they are and to elevate them. And then also to kind of create a list of the kinds of practices that you want to work on, and that are, going to be a lifetime of work. So, right. So patience for me sometimes gets out of whack. It's something I always have to be focused on and work on, so that it doesn't get to one of the extreme ends of the spectrum. And I think for each person it's different. And part of practice of Mussar is to figure out uh, your own life curriculum. That everybody's curriculum in life is different from another person.
I think it's a really useful way of talking about your own life curriculum. Can I ask a couple questions about that? Is it each individual's job to come up with their own life curriculum,
Yeah.
or is that shaped through community?
Well, it's a good question. I think a little bit of both. I think it is each person's job to figure out their own life curriculum, but I think it is shaped and defined a little bit by the community in which we live. I think there's no question about that.
As a rabbi and with your team of other rabbis, do you have a role in helping shape people's life curriculum? Do they come to you for that kind of spiritual direction, or do you remain hands off unless you're asked? How does that work for you?
Yeah, we've run some Mussar groups, for example, to help people figure out their life curriculum. And then people come to meet with rabbis all the time and say, I'm stuck. Can you help me get unstuck? And they may not have the vocabulary for spiritual curriculum or life curriculum, but we can help them get to that.
Oh man, that's great. That's great to hear. Now, these are some really out of left field questions. So if you get stuck for a second, we can move right on. But I'm curious in terms of things that we can maybe even point our audience to. Is there a song or a musician or a record or album that really embodies something of the spirit of Jewish spirituality that you love or that you could point to? Uh,
There's plenty. Uh, you know, uh, Shlomo Carlebach was a great Jewish musician who really integrated midot character, the midot into his music and into his everyday. He had a deeply compassionate soul. So I think there I'll give that some thought. There are plenty of other examples too.
Well, how about any films or yeah, or other pieces of media? And we could put books in here as well. It's just basically, for those interested in digging up something that might help them, I'm always interested in showing and sharing.
There's a book by, I don't remember the exact title, but the author is Alan Marinis, Morrinis, and he wrote a book called, um, uh, it's got the word Mussar in it. I don't remember the
Okay.
title.
Well, we'll fish that up. Now, how about
Yeah.
for you? Like as in your spiritual life curriculum, you're going about your day. What sorts of things do you maybe it may not even be specifically religious, but what sorts of music really kind of lift your soul, or what films really inspire you? Just some hot takes there.
Yeah, I like to listen to music that often has no words because I think it, in the spirit of that we were talking about earlier, the
Mm,
nigun, the wordless melody, it really allows me to concentrate and to um, bring up the words of the heart, if you will.
mm.
So I certainly listen to music with words. Don't get me
Sure.
wrong, but
Well,
yeah.
well, I'm going to press in on that and ask you if you do. I mean, if you don't, that's okay. But do you have any recommendations of musicians or bands or groups? We're always looking for recommendations.
I have to think about that a little
Okay.
bit. That one is not coming to me right
Like I
clearly.
said, they're from left field.
Yeah, but I'll work on that for you.
That's okay. That's all right. How about films? What are some films that have inspired you, spiritually, morally, things that have just gotten into your imagination?
Some of the films there are some great Jewish films out there. There's actually a Jewish film festival here in Atlanta every year that shows. It's the largest Jewish film festival in the world, I believe, and it's really worth spending some time. I want to encourage people to when it comes out. It's in January every year to think about just seeing a film or two. You can look it up by subject. There are documentaries. There are comedies. There are films made by European producers, Israeli producers, American producers, and actors, and they're all really really good. Um, I find many of the Holocaust films to be, as difficult as they are, to be very meaningful, and they often tell really poignant stories that I can relate to and find very meaningful.
Is there one Holocaust film? I think we've all seen a couple of them that were lauded by the Academy or
Right,
by the motion
Schindler's
picture.
List is the classic.
Is that's the one that's okay? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean that's a masterpiece. But so yeah. So here's the thing: the Jewish Film Festival is coming up here in Atlanta, and I usually try to take in a film or two. Do you get out yourself to see many of
I
those during the
do. I
season?
usually I go to usually the opening night, and then I try to see. I'm on the board of the Jewish Film Festival, and I try to see as many of the films as I can. It's not easy because I have a full-time job, but I do try to get to see as many as I can.
Well, listen, I'm gonna ask Alan to put this together and put it out before January if we can, just to advertise that. But it's good to know that you're also on that board. Let me ask you. Okay, you are a full-time rabbi, so here's what that means from my perspective as your neighbor across the street. You lead one of the larger Jewish communities in Atlanta. You're right in the middle of Midtown. You're right in right in the heart of our city. And because of that, your presence has got you caring for a congregation, the spiritual life of your congregation. You got to preach, you got to teach, you got to attend to weddings and funerals. But quite clearly, you also speak out for the Jewish community to our city and beyond. I mean, I've read quotes of you in the New York Times. So that has a lot to do with our legislation, or it has a lot to do with raising awareness. You are busy. You have a lot of people interested in what you have to say. And then I bug you sometimes and ask you to hang out a little. I mean, so you're a very, very busy guy. What do you yourself, to just unplug from it all and unwind? Like, what's relaxing for you? What feeds you after you've been giving and feeding others throughout? I mean, I'm asking as a clergy person, colleague, and friend, because I run around too, trying to
Yeah,
give. What do
yeah.
you do
So
to feed yourself?
you know the life. You are every bit just as busy and running around. I For me, there's a couple things. One is I do try to take time to rest every once in a while. We went away for a week over Thanksgiving. We're going away next week for a couple of days for the holidays, just to be with family and to unplug. So I do try to unplug a little bit. I am energized. I mentioned this word earlier in our talk, chavruta, it means chaver means friend in Hebrew. So it's a study friend, a study partner. And I have lots of study partners around the country, rabbis that I meet with and talk to and learn from and study with. And I find that to be a very a way to really uh, uh, dial back and focus. I'm an avid reader, and I sometimes, I mean, I read all the stuff you're supposed to read as a rabbi, which is a lot. I know you have the same pile of books in many ways, but I also like to read, sometimes mindless, just to disengage and just to read something that's not so heady and not so serious. Those are some of the things. If I do like to go skiing once a year. We don't live in a city that has snow, or mountains that are skiable. So I have to, go to Colorado or something like that. But I do really enjoy that, and I enjoy being outside and just connecting with outside.
I find when I unplug the way you're talking about that, it often somehow out there, whether I'm taking a walk or reading something else, it helps me provide answers for my work or what I'm dealing with. Like somehow loosening my brain from the problems. Somehow it's almost like that ease brings me into a greater ability to deal with the problems I'm facing. So it's good to get away for sure. Yeah. Well, listen, I really appreciate the time that you spent with us today. As a final word, and this doesn't have to do with Mussar, but do you have 2 or 3 books or texts that you think if you could just make everyone read, what would they be? 2 or 3 texts that would shape Americans, shape Jews, Christians, Muslims, anybody that they should just read, in your opinion. Doesn't have to be preachy. I don't know. Whatever you think's important.
I would say Everyday Holiness, the book that I mentioned earlier by Alan Marinis, I think is a really thoughtful text about Mussar, but it's about living everyday life. It's accessible. You don't have to be Jewish to read it. I think it's very accessible. I think Exodus by Leon Uris is a really thoughtful, long and important book. There's a book called As a Driven Leaf that I think is a really powerful book about life in the Mishnaic era that is both beautiful and historically accurate. It's called As a Driven Leaf. So those are some of the ones that I would think
Wow.
about right out of the gate.
All right. Well, my friend, listen, it has been a pleasure to talk with you today. I hope you restful time away, and thank you for these words. God bless.
Thank you for your friendship, and thank you for the invitation to be here.